First, we hear from Rob Robinson. He's the managing principal at Urban Design Associates in Pittsburgh.
Oh, thanks. I haven't said anything yet, so no clapping. But we're not gonna talk about so much construction or physical housing units. We are going to talk about innovation, and it's been really interesting for us over the years. It's almost impossible for this word to come out of my mouth, but I've been doing this for 40 years, and I started in Richmond, 1975, and I got interested in urban issues, urbanism in general, but really housing and what was happening in cities and our jobs, all of our jobs, involved in affordable housing and how do you deliver housing to the market and all the stuff that goes along with that. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit is how I think things are at a sort of a paradigm shift. Things are changing a lot in cities. The ways we think about neighborhoods, the ways we think about cities, the way we think about housing in cities has dramatically shifted. So I'm going to focus on Pittsburgh a little bit during the course of this presentation and talk about a phenomena. I think we always talk about innovation if it's some outside force or some brilliance that dawns on you somewhere. But what we're finding is that it exists everywhere, and it's in very many different forms, and we're starting to see that there are different streams now that we can play with. And they come in different ways.
When you talk to people about plastic bottle, they see it as a means to a future. We pull trash from the very poorest neighborhoods in the world and we turn it into fabric.
And we believe in the power of work.
There's still people in the communities that we serve that live and work, go to school. Those people have been forgotten. What Thread's really good at is helping introduce the world to those people that shows who they really are. The way that products are made right now isn't as good as they could be. So
for the first time, we're about to fire up some sewing machines, hire people from Homewood in Pittsburgh, because we're about to start making things.
By just putting on your clothes in the morning, you can make a difference in somebody else's life. And the better at Thread that we're able to connect the person at the very bottom of the supply chain with the person at the end, the more beautiful that story can be.
So Ian Rosenberger, a young entrepreneur, grew up, went to school in Pittsburgh, came back, and started a company called Thread. So it's got that really interesting arc, from turning waste into something useful. That was in Haiti. They're kind of all over the world. And they're in a burned-out neighborhood in Pittsburgh, in Homewood, starting a whole new production business there. So, it's that kind of thinking that really starts to change the nature of the way our city is regenerating itself and what the opportunities are within that scope. Here's another little thing. So I'm just working on this. This was a young tech entrepreneur based in San Francisco, from Chicago. I met him in Huntsville, Alabama, of all places. And we started talking about this whole idea of social equity and what really happens in neighborhoods. Lo and behold, he goes back to Chicago. He's a Jordanian guy. His family used to run a lot of little shops, little retail shops in Cabrini Green. So we're doing a little building on his family's corner in Cabrini Green. That's it on the right-hand side. So O'Day is his name. He doesn't really have to do any affordable housing, but he wants to do something that has an impact for this neighborhood. So what did he do? He started inventing a program for this building on the corner. It sits right where the little retail thing is on the left-hand side, and this is a rendering of it. So what happens? He's recruiting. There's actually no retail in this neighborhood now. It sort of stops. He's recruiting local businesses for the ground floor. It's got 2 of them now. Above that, there's a co-working and a kind of community space that he's forged a relationship with the public school, middle school in the neighborhood, so that there's mentoring and tutoring space every day of the week and the weekends. on the second floor. He's doing 20% for what were former public housing residents in Cabrini Green within his building. And then he's doing another little program of discounted rents for teachers in the neighborhood. Like, what else can you do? You know, this is a guy, a single practitioner, a private market guy, not a big production for a number of units, and we're able to work through those issues in a way that we never could before. In our practice at UDA, we always look for this idea about the sort of middle ground or middle scale. We talk about the missing middle now, how little there is of that. But it really comes into play when you're making neighborhoods. And it's one of those things where innovation almost always happens by the process. This is in Johns Hopkins, where we were doing work. This was a combination of a public housing redevelopment and the biotech expansion for Hopkins. Hopkins and the surrounding neighborhoods, any of you from Baltimore, you know the deal. It was a really war zone there. And we used the process for this to create a treaty between the adjoining neighborhoods and the institution. So the institution is now part and parcel of building housing and building neighborhoods with every building they build in this side of East Baltimore. The schools were brought in, so it becomes a big kind of neighborhood production to build a new neighborhood, one that feels like it's always been part of Baltimore and again is that kind of middle scale. Same thing in Detroit, completely blown out city, as you know, in many parts of it. And this idea of bringing back smaller scale neighborhoods that are connected to public open space along the river in a very different way creates like a whole new billboard for bringing people back into the city. And it goes on. Charlotte First Ward, a quarter of the uptown completely gone when we started. It was a field, more or less, and one housing project. And as we thought about it, it wasn't about just rebuilding the project. It was about how do we build a new urban precinct that's a quarter of the scale of Charlotte. And we got a lot of heat for this. You see the towers in the background on the lower right-hand side. Coming out of the box, the city wanted to go super high density here and giant buildings. We probably at that time wouldn't have gone up so tall, but we would have been really big. Instead, we pushed and we had a lot of support for just being very diverse and being much more about Charlotte neighborhoods coming into the downtown, large, gradually getting taller towards Tryon and Trade. So it makes a huge difference in the way that city feels. If we take my own city in Pittsburgh, where I've been living for 30-some years, and we look at where its roots were, this is a city, as you all know, went completely off the sliding board into the into the water, such as it was. This was Pittsburgh in 1938. It was a big mill, is what it was. Nobody lived downtown. The Fortune 500 companies were all transacting downtown. And every neighborhood in Pittsburgh, we forget about this, all up and down the river valleys, they were all mill towns. So when all of this went away, these were not the sort of highest and most desirable sought-after properties in the region. These were tough places, and had essentially been left behind. But talk about a culture of innovation. They were all makers. They were all making all kinds of stuff all the time. So you have all these people that tinker. And also, early on, there's this sense that we could do anything. And the very first part of the innovation here was cleaning up the water and cleaning up the air. And so they made the leadership here at that time, 1950, began to take the city, the downtown apart and put it back together again. This is where the former mill was along the river. So it's been a really interesting transition. It's been there sort of the 30 years since I've been there. I saw the mills up, saw them come down, watched everybody get really depressed for a long time, and then watched the downtown come back. It really didn't come back without the incredible tenacity of the cultural trust, believe it or not. The folks who run the theaters in downtown, they decided that that downtown had to be a destination. So they ended up programming about half of downtown and starting to buy long-term leases in buildings and repurpose them, getting restaurants on the ground floor, housing above. So this is like a completely different place in downtown now. All of the conversion of a lot of these old corporate office buildings have become housing. I walk by 2 charter schools, an arts magnet school. There's another charter high school in what was once just all office buildings on Penn Avenue in downtown. But the real action is happening outside in the old warehouse districts, just like here with Scott's Addition and other places, Manchester. You see this transformation. But if Golden Triangle that we looked at is the yellow there, the red were all the rail yards running along the Allegheny River and little neighborhoods. This is where it's like completely hot in Pittsburgh. And it's not like it's great stuff. It's not something that we would recommend a city go after. It's completely, to us, completely counterintuitive. So you look at it, you can see the flats along the river, and then you look up the hill. So Pittsburgh is a big hill in the middle of those rivers, and then it flattens out a little bit as you get to it. But it was all blue-collar, mill worker housing, jam-packed together, and you could be next door from somebody who's making, diesel engines, literally. And so you get streetscapes that look rough, and they're kind of not the homiest sort of places, but this is where all the new stuff is crawling back into the city of Pittsburgh. The sort of high-tech industry that's there, been incubating. People would prefer living here than in great Pittsburgh neighborhoods, where it's a little more classic, and you just couldn't see it coming. It's all mashed up. It's exciting. It's repurposing old buildings. There's new stuff going on, but we know, all of us in this room know, once you go to new construction for things get really expensive. So how do people participate? How does this really affect us? So what we see in Lawrenceville is a sort of an extension of a retail street. It actually goes for about 40 blocks through the city. It's almost all filled up again. It's taken about 8-9 years, but it's remarkable. And then this is the new downtown. This is where somebody comes to visit me, here's where we're going. We'll start at the river, but we're going to end up here because it's where everything is happening. And so great stuff is happening in here. You get the little brick building on the end, looks like an old building that was built about 3 years ago. So we're starting to get new incremental development by individuals. And it's a really broad and diverse range of folks. They thought they were happy with the first one, they did a second one. These are tiny lots. You never see this stuff. Apartments up, little local shops below. There's no national retailers here at all. These are young, new businesses climbing back into the city. And then we get, again, a full range of new apartments and new housing tucked into a main street, which is just incredible. This place is thriving, and it's everybody. It's not like just a few. It's all folks from all walks of life. So this has become an amazing story to me about the local nature of really resuscitating a place. And we're at one end. You can see in that photograph there may be 6 new little infill buildings there. Not one out of region developer. These are all small developers. This is sort of shepherded by the Lawrenceville Corporation. But in neighborhoods in Pittsburgh hate to be planned, so the city won't go in there. These are sort of locally run and organized neighborhoods. But I find that this, to me, is the most innovative thing happening in Pittsburgh and in many cities. It's not that we just see it here, but the scale is right, the context is right, and the culture is right, because it's all of these kind of guys like Ian who are crawling back into these buildings, doing amazing things. Art is part of it, but it's art with a small a, not art with a big A. So it's like art all night in one of the old factories. It happens all the time here. So we've now got a whole new range of public spaces. The Parks Department would never put a park in like this. this is all happening organically and locally, but making amazing kinds of places. So you wouldn't think right off the bat that this would be hot real estate, but it turns out it's accessible, and young folks and folks who don't have the income to go into the larger houses or other neighborhoods up on the hill, they're thriving in Lawrenceville. It's interesting to note, when you look up at the top of the hill, that's the Children's Hospital. So everybody who's working in that and can get a place to live, when you start tracking it, it's amazing because of the breadth and the depth of that market. And then all the new tech companies that have been touted in Pittsburgh, they're all crawling into the older buildings like they do in Richmond, and they're right in the neighborhood, right? They're right next door to you. So that kind of mashup is really different. So between doing robotics and Uber doing their driverless cars in and around this district, it's like a circus every week. You can hardly believe it. So we're excited about this level of reinvestment in city real estate that you would have thought we'll be tearing all this stuff down because nobody wants it. Well, it's not true. And if you leave people to their own devices and you put them in a little petri dish where all this stuff cooks together, then things happen. So coming out of this, this has been going on for about 10 years. It suddenly struck the leadership and folks living in the neighborhood that they better have a very discrete policy about affordability, about social equity, about what's going on in this neighborhood. And so it's exciting, it's fun. I think it's what I'd call embedded innovation, and when you can find it in a city, go for it, because you realize you suddenly have a whole culture that talks the same language about these issues that are common to all of us. Thank you very much.